for me, that kind of adherence away from rational stability makes a lot of sense for the ways in which we're trying to articulate why politicized bodies like ours and how those bodies move about the world. It's important to me to kind of refuse the viewer that kind of access. And print does that so much better, I believe, than so many other media. And so to articulate this conversation between the two of us through print and watch the print surface sort of manipulate or materialize in the sculpture in front of us, some of the paintings on the wall, even the kind of topography of what I call the king-size inner tube mattress on the ground becomes really, really interesting. The narrative textures that we can achieve and really talk about this kind of liminal space of immigrant communities becomes incredibly interesting.
So the conversations were enlightening and interesting throughout 2017. And more than anything, it was the sharing of discrete images, or when we'd get together for workshop days at the Experimental Printmaking Institute, and Didier would produce work that he would then carry back to Philadelphia to become collages for his paintings. I would pull some of those same prints and hang them on my wall, and they didn't necessarily become visible elements in the work, but they became the language that informed how I was working. So I'm not sure that the work I've produced here comes out of me the way that it did without the collaboration this year. There was a lot of that conversation informed just the way that I was thinking about the relationship between the two-dimensional in the print studio and the three-dimensional. Sculpture and print have so much in common. They're so process-oriented. There's so many layers.
So physical.
So physical. That's well put. And just that reverse thinking that you were talking about and the layering of print is so much a part of the way that I think about sculpture, right? And in fact, to bring it back to the paintings for a moment, it's also a lot of the way that you attack these paintings, especially when carving these eyes, that becomes very sculptural in spite of the fact that we're looking at a two-dimensional picture plane.
Absolutely. Just before we started, I was having a conversation with someone about the eyes and about kind of my refusal to ever print the panels, because all the paintings are on wood panel, and the eyes that you see in them are carved directly into the surface of the panel. They're not printed or drawn. They're literally carved incised into the surface. And for me, the eyes became a way of articulating the potential to have bodies that are usually the receptors of curious, nefarious gazes return some of that gaze back to the viewer. Really meditating on whether or not if our bodies could look back, not just with our facade, but with our fingers, with our forehead, with our shoulders, with our knees, what could that potentially look like? If the kind of fetishized, objectified body that all of us occupy attempts to return a gaze that in so doing allows it to maintain some of its own agency, how would that look on a painting? And how could we then take that symbol and combine it with various other historical motifs? For example, the painting behind you, the composition is taken just from Jacques-Louis David's Death of Marat, except I replaced Marat's idealized body with the body of Ma Tante Toya, who was Jean-Jacques Dessalines' aunt during the Haitian Revolution, and she was actually one of his soldiers in battle. And for all those of us who study Haitian history, Dessalines, unlike Louverture, was an incredibly violent revolutionary. Louverture was known to be a little bit more tame to the colonialists. Dessalines ordered the killing of 5,000 French who were still on the island after Haiti had already won the revolution. One of his most formidable soldiers was his aunt, Ma Tante Toya Matu. David painted Death of Marat in 1793. The Haitian Revolution began in 1791. And I was really interested in trying to collapse these two historical moments for many reasons, but for one, because Haiti, the battle cry for the revolution, came right out of the French Revolution. And really interested in thinking about these two idealized bodies. One, the body of Marat. Many historians believe that the reason he was in the tub in the first place is because he suffered from what they think was a form of eczema. And so he was a friend of David. So David idealized his body. In the painting, he's very slick and rendered smoothly, but in real life, he actually had this horrible skin disease, which required him to take these oatmeal baths. So he was in the oatmeal bath. Charlotte Corday knew this, entered the bath, and killed him. So his body was already idealized in history. But in my painting, I really wanted to take the body of Desaling's aunt, Toyamantu, and idealize her in the same way, but instead of removing that skin disease in the original context of the painting, I put it back in, but now it's rendered through these eyes that have a particular symbolism in my work.
And so the idea of the body, when I start producing work, it takes on a very vague space for me intellectually and emotionally, in part because the original people of the island of Cuba were completely eradicated by colonialism. There are no real Cubans left when one considers that history. So that anytime that today a person who identifies as Cuban looks in the mirror, what they're seeing looking back at them might be a post-European body or a post-African body, but what they're not seeing looking back at them is a Cuban body. There happens to be one of the beautiful coincidences or tragic coincidences of language, a butterfly that looks like this in contour that is endemic to the island of Cuba, and its name is Dysmorphia cubana. Because it's a mimic butterfly, and the name dysmorphia, when applied to these butterflies, represents that it's a mimic of another butterfly from another place. But dysmorphia, as we know, also means the inability to recognize our own body. Bodybuilders might experience dysmorphia, or people suffering with conditions like anorexia might suffer dysmorphia, looking in the mirror and not being able to see an accurate depiction of themselves looking back. And it started to occur to me through our conversations, especially about body, that my body is a space that is physically in flux, because I stare into a mirror and looking back at me as a body that I don't recognize. And perhaps all contemporary Cuban people are experiencing a kind of psychic dysmorphia cubana, right? A sense of not recognizing the self that we imagine to be staring back at us. This manifests itself through a lot of different imagery in the work, especially these, what some people have been calling yams, because they're very yam-like, but I think of them more as grubs. So the sort of early birthplace of what becomes the butterfly, or as chrysali, the place where the butterfly is transformed. These chrysali are actually filled with black beans and rice, which definitely is the blood that runs through my body. I don't know about every Cuban, but this body is all beans and rice. And then on the back wall, there's a print that shows the same information, but now laid out as a pair of wings, almost pinned to the wall for examination, the way that butterflies might be pinned to the wall to be looked at. On a technical note, it's worth noting, I think, that a lot of the work I've produced for the show is based on the form of the inner tube, which is the vessel that many Cuban and other Caribbean peoples have used in order to cross water to come to the United States. The piece that's here on the side wall is a two-part print entitled "A New Vision for Travel by Sea," and it's 5 images of an inner tube. So it suggests the inner tube as a contemporary boat for people who are in the act of migration. The same texture that you see on the grubs and on the wings in the back there was pulled as a collograph, a direct print from a chunk of inner tube. So I really tried to bring that language again and again into the various forms, so that even when it's transformed completely away from the materiality of the rubber, there's still some of that texture being realized in another form, almost as fecund with life.
And there's so much surface in the entire exhibition that I think made sense to both of us. And yesterday, when we were speaking to a different group, I brought up this idea of tenderness. And by that I mean, I think we both, even prior to the collaboration, have been thinking about ways in which we could take historical motifs, historical iconography that points to the conversations in both our works, and reappropriate or reimagine them through this, maybe away from this language of post-colonial violence or even empire, and into the kind of tender conditions that allow them to sit within contemporary life, and how we negotiate with them as a body, as a corporeal entity dealing with another body in the world. I know certainly it's something I think about as a painter. I'm very much interested in painting surfaces that don't resolve. I think that's what pulled me away from paint on canvas initially, because I found it to be too much of a homogeneous surface. I needed a surface that shifted dramatically from matte to glossy to gritty to smooth to fluid to rigid. It's very important to me that the painting surface does that at its very core. There's a painting right to our left with the text sort of drawn into it. That's all carving and no collage, no painting, none of the kind of theatrical romance of the other work. I wanted a painting that shifted away from that conversation and did something a bit more declarative. So I filled the painting with the kind of fecundity that Nestor mentioned earlier, but except this time it was just eyes. And the eyes themselves began to point to a kind of collective body rather than a singular body, a body that includes that of the viewer, and in some cases maybe even resists that of the viewer, and denies the kind of harmonious resolution that was so pertinent and so important and so prevalent around the time of the election last year. And in fact, reasserts a kind of multiplicity and a kind of boundary building that I think many of us who occupy vulnerable bodies rely on to survive.
Yeah, right. What Didier said. There was a wonderful happenstance that occurred after Curly's initial invitation for us to collaborate. Didier and I got to work, and a lot of the conversation that we had was, making discoveries about histories that each of us have with Miami. Didier was raised in Miami. I'm the rare Cuban who was not raised in Miami, but I was here all the time because I have a lot of extended family here. So for me, it was almost a paradise to visit and enter spaces where there was a kind of familiarity that I embodied but didn't understand. But the history of Haitianness and Cubanness in this space is not without its problems, and those histories became a part of our early conversations, the tensions that arose between these communities. In a quick nutshell, when the Cubans arrived, the Americans who were here extended no help. And so Cubans built what they could and did well at it. And in one of those strange twists of fate that seemed to attend immigration to the United States historically, the arrival of large numbers of Haitian people to this area was met by Cubans with a similar reaction to the one that Americans had leveled against Cubans when we first arrived, right? And so Haitians were basically left to their own devices and have also, managed to build quite a wonderful community here in this space against that resistance that was being leveled against them. So Miami becomes geographically, a place for challenge, and there's all of this hope that typically attends an immigrant saga. Hope that might be embodied in things like the comfort of a blanket or in the beads of a rosary and the way that faith might drive some of these journeys. But when we come face to face with the sort of net result of all of that hope, it's not always as soft and creamy and welcoming as we might have thought that it would be. And the opportunities that are there are not necessarily doors that are open. Perhaps the doors are shut tight. But having made these journeys, most people might be damned before they fail to bang on the door, or kick it down if necessary. I think that those histories became a very important part of the early conversation that we were having. And even when we left a lot of that conversation behind, I think that in some ways it continued to be embodied in the work, so that what winds up in the room is what I take to be a really active and engaged conversation between two, taken on their own, distinct bodies of work.
Yeah, I mean, having grown up in Miami, it's always a peculiar thing to come back and visit my parents in the place that I occupied as a large black guy who was born on this tiny island 250 miles south of Key West. And I absolutely vividly remember driving down 79th Street and Biscayne Boulevard before we had Homeland Security. It's called Immigration and Naturalization Services, an office that we spent hours at. And I always say one of the reasons why I'm a morning person is because even as a kid, we would have to go line up at INS to prove our willingness to be here so that we wouldn't get deported. And now at 34, I wake up at 5 a.m. every day ready to go, afraid that I'm still going to get deported or something. But I vividly remember driving down 79th Street and the Cuban population of Miami protesting Elian Gonzalez who was not, who was about to be sent back by Janet Reno. And the protests were happening loudly and vividly right in front of me as I was driving down. But I remember just a few weeks prior to that, there was a young Haitian girl who washed up on shore on an inner tube after having lost her mother on the island and her father in transit. And she was sent back immediately, right away.
Very different conditions.
Very different conditions. And so seeing something like that as a child coming of age in Miami, you become hyper aware of physical space and the body's ability to inform and influence politicized physical space in a very potent way. And so oftentimes in the paintings, this idea of the object, the physical object and the space that it occupies is so important to me, specifically because I know very well in sites like Miami, and there's countless other places like this in the US, the body that you occupy determines everything. The politicized body that you occupy, whether it's feminized or racialized in a particular way, or made foreign in a particular way, all of which happens when home is constructed as this thing that's elsewhere, becomes really crucial, really critical to the conversation. And an avid denial of that kind of resolution for me is critically important, because in recognition, in the ability to know is also the ability to own. And I think that's oftentimes where I split ways with representation, strict figurative representation, because it doesn't require enough of my viewer, it doesn't require enough of my interlocutor.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, we can do this forever. You guys.
Yeah, we can keep chatting a long time.
But we welcome
Yes,
questions.
sir.
Could you talk just a little bit about how your practice, your investigation informed each other, how you took things from each other because of the exchange? And that's one thing that happens in the collaborative process. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. There's one really stark example in one of Didier's paintings in the back room there, where two different examples of the machete, which is both domestic and agrarian tool, and also symbolic weapon of Caribbean Revolution. And in that particular piece, there's this wonderful patterning of machete that Didier produced, and you can see that in a few of the pieces in the show. And in response to that, when we came to this notion of the word swarm as a title for the shared exhibition, I started producing swarms as images. One such swarm is this swarm of inner tubes here on this poster, which is a takeaway. You're welcome to take one or some of those with you if you like. But on that painting in the back, there was a pen and ink drawing that I produced of a swarm of machetes on a small scale. And before I knew it, Didier and Jace Clark, the master printmaker at EPI, were enlarging that. And Didier was taking back to Philadelphia, sheets of this swarm of hand-drawn machetes, and then wound up collaging them into that back painting in quite a beautiful way. So there's a very physical, visible example of the way that we were throwing images at one another. But I also would comment on what happened at the point of installation, which really Didier noticed when he first walked into the space after those of us who did all the work got the thing installed. So when he came in, comfy,
Good job.
yeah, right. He noticed immediately that these rosary beads here in the sculpture on the floor have an incredibly resonant relationship with the heads on that just brilliant painting that he's got there on the back wall. And that close relationship of form became very interesting for us very quickly. And if you send your attention to the other corner of the room, there's just great painting of Didier's there, and just in front of it, the stretched piece, which is called Tirón de Guerra, which means tug of war, but is probably more accurately translated to the pull of war, so something of a yearning or a longing. And then just in that sense, the color palette of each of those pieces really resonates with one another. And I think that examples of those overlaps became more visible to us here in the space once we were here together looking at the work installed. Whereas during the year, there were countless images of, Didier, look at this. And I'm sure on his end, oh, what the hell is Nestor doing? What is this supposed to, no.
Yeah, it'd be interesting for us to take all the texts that we exchanged back and forth and bind that into a book or something.
Right.
Just to see the conversation over the year and how it took place, because it was innumerable. And to Nestor's point, the fourth collaborator in here, aside from Nestor Curley and myself, is Jace Clark, who is the master printer. And Jace was incredible. We would, make drawings and scratch things out and then hand them to Jace. And Jace would turn them into screens, he would turn them into woodblocks, he would turn them into copper etchings. And then we would then take those copper etchings back to the studio and continue to manipulate them until they became the painted surface. And there's something about the kind of pattern and friction that in my studio becomes sort of rigid with military precision, that in Nestor's studio becomes organic and fluid and sort of unfurls. And that's what I got excited about with the machetes and that painting in the back. I had kind of worked towards this emblematic crosshairs made out of machetes that I was really excited about, and I was going to use them to articulate these receding curtains on this artificial platform. But then when I noticed Nestor's much more organic machetes and their potential to essentially puncture a perspectival hole on the surface of the painting, I got much more excited about that, and then interrupted the rigid pattern with a much more organic pattern of Nestor's that quite literally punctures a perspectival hole into the painting that I got super excited about.
I love punching perspectival holes. It's something I really love to do. The opportunity to do that there was very welcome opportunity. Yes, sir.
Are those panels on the floor an exhibit or a potential exhibit, or?
Pretty cool, right?
I'll
No,
sign
that's
it.
not part of it.
No, that was in the
The one.
Oh, you mean these?
The posters, the
posters.
interviews.
Oh, posters. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes, sir. Those are for taking away. It's a sculpture that you can peel one off the top and the sculpture recedes. And as people take them and leave, they swarm out into the community, as the title of the show would suggest.
Oh.
Yeah, grab some.
We also like, maybe it might be a bad idea to say a little bit about the title Swarm of the exhibition. I think we're thinking about Swarm as a construction, as an artificial construction, but also as almost like a nomadic collective that moves as a singular body, but is made up of multiple individual bodies. We also thought about it as a kind of graphic directive, as an imperative, as a kind of meditation on what survival might or should look like moving forward out of this particular moment of incredible political tension. How does one survive making room for omnipresent threats and tensions on one's body, direct interactions and interventions to one's body that make one hyper aware of one's own vulnerability? Swarm for us becomes this potential for an other kind of being that allows us to retain some of that agency.
We are living in a time when conversations that, I don't know if anybody could be foolish enough to think they were settled, but conversations that we might have imagined to have progressed to a certain point, it suddenly turning out that they haven't. I remember, daytime, I was taking care of my grandmother in her last years, and daytime talk in the late 80s and early 90s would bring these bozos dressed in hateful clothing, whether it was swastika armbands or white hoods, onto Sally Jesse Raphael's stage so that the audience could uniformly mock them and reveal how ridiculously out of place they were in a contemporary progressive society. And now it seems that those voices and those identities have recentered themselves and are gaining purchase in the popular imagination in a way that I'm born in the United States and I'm made nervous by it. I'm born in the United States and I'm made frightened by it. Frightened for myself, frightened for my family, frightened for people who speak with an accent, as many of my relatives do. It seems that a lot of the signposts of identity that were starting to represent a kind of American unity are now being leveled against individuals when for so long they were beginning to occupy the possibility of being markers of pride. And now people who would maybe yesterday have overtly identified themselves through markers of pride are called upon to potentially quiet down again or to potentially, lower the sort of volume of our presence again. And that's, to me, that's incredibly frightening, because we imagine progress, cultural progress, to be something that that moves forward. And while we can't be surprised by backward motion, it's ignorance that would leave us surprised. We can still be bothered by it, right? By the idea that hope is being questioned, sort of actively questioned by the realities that are unfolding around us. I don't.
Well, it's important to realize why the toxic degenerate in the White House decided that he would revoke the Obama allowances that allowed 59,000 Haitians to remain in the States after the earthquake. It's important to know where the fear of Haiti comes from. It's important to know what happened in 1804 and what sent chills through the spines of all colonialists in 1804 and continues to do so about Haiti. Where that fear comes from, it's critical to remember that this was a moment in history when black people said no. And this country always has a problem when black people say no. This country always has a problem when we refuse access to our bodies. And that's critical for me, that what happens in that space, to form, to figures, to geography, to identity, to location, is really critical to understand and think about and sit with, because that's where I think a lot of the creative space that we channel in this work comes from.
I could listen to this guy all day. Are there any other questions? If anyone would like to focus on a particular work or anything like that, we're happy to do that as well.
Nestor?
Yes.
Can you talk about this piece?
Yes, sure. This comforter, the title of the work is Comfort, or Edredon, which means blanket or comforter. And the material is inner tube material, which is the material of the common sea vessel used by Caribbean islanders to travel across the most dangerous waters, the Florida Straits, which are incredibly dangerous waters. I like the idea of a thing that is both beautiful and alluring and also repellent. The industrial quality of the material, it makes me want to lay on it, and it makes me never want to lay on it. I know that physically because I was asked to lay on it the other day for a photograph, and I can tell you, it's not a nice thing to lay on. It's produced through a knitting process. So we were trying to knit it onto my arms, but it got incredibly heavy, so we used two 2x4s as knitting needles in order to produce the work on a substrate that would allow it to be supported while we continued to build it. I very much am drawn to the idea of seeking something in which we can envelop ourselves, something in which we can wrap ourselves and try to find a kind of comfort, or maybe sometimes a kind of hiding, a way to make ourselves less accessible. But I also think about the way that a lot of the, arrival is never outfitted with the same qualities that desire. It's our fantasies are always greater than the realities that they imagine, and so there's something about this work that I hope is somewhat repellent. At the same time that I want its poetry to be quite alluring and beautiful, and there's actually something about that I search for in my work in general, that it would be problematic to find it beautiful, right? And yet I also obviously hope that it's impossible not to.
I love the way you talk about arrival with this piece, because maybe it's the knitting, maybe it's the scale, but I always think of it as a kind of tender domestic object. I kind of want to fold it up, put it in the laundry, put some fabric softener in it, and then pull it out and cover myself with it. But the fact that it's these inner tubes, it's made up of these inner tubes, which are used as a means for arrival, as a means to access some kind of liberation, really makes me start to think of the things, particularly with my parents. There are certain things that they brought with them from Haiti that never go away, that they don't need anymore, that we don't, maybe we don't have access to, but that piece of clothing, that piece of, that beaded curtain in my mom's case, that briefcase of stuff that was not left behind, that you really have no other purpose for it, other than allowing it to bolster the kind of transnational imaginary that allows you to locate home somehow, which is one of the reasons I absolutely love this piece.
Appreciate that. My father's a car guy. He taught high school auto body shop when he finally finished his education with 5 kids in the States. And, you know, as far as stuff that my parents brought with them, it was zero stuff. So what they certainly brought was sensibilities and ideation about what the world was and the need to produce, because if they were going to have made the kinds of journeys that they made to get to the places that they got, it was certainly not going to be to then sort of sit idle in the wake of that arrival. But nonetheless, even though the automotive quality does certainly echo the personal in regard to my father, the formal quality, the production of a blanket or a comforter, the production of a rosary out of the same material, echoes most clearly back to the women in my family, who were just brilliantly strong women. My mother, my grandmother, who, for all intents and purposes, are the voices that raised me through my life. And in as much as a man can possibly do so, which I'm not sure the extent to which a man can, I think that they informed through a so-called feminine lens the way that I look at the world. So when Didier talks about tenderness in the work, and I mean in the work of the whole exhibition, that very much resonates with me, because I see in the word tenderness the role that my mother and my grandmother played with me. And it was a kind of tenderness that involved chancletas across my face, and you know, it was not, it wasn't a tender tenderness, but it was definitely determined toward a kind of sense of cultural fertility, you know, a sense of carrying forward, carrying within, and then you know, pouring out, which is something that as men we don't have the opportunity to do that the way that women's bodies do, right? So I think I try to house some of that in my work, and I certainly don't mean to presume to know the experience of it by any stretch, but how it's informed my experience is pretty profound.
And I think I like to take that sort of notion of tenderness, or construction of tenderness, and meditate on its potential to move across specifically gendered bodies in my work. So, for example, the painting to the right, Two Dads, was a painting where I was meditating on masculinity a bit, and thinking about not necessarily even deconstructing masculinity, but sort of laying it bare, processed through the bodies of the two masculine forms that I understand most fervently, my husband and my father. And to really think, if I could make a painting that was about both of them at the same time, what would that look like in its homosexuality, in its figuration, in its patterning, in its structure, in its texture? Could it occupy both a kind of tender space of love and intimacy, but also be honest about the fact that doubling the masculine body might mean doubling the toxicity that masculinity poses and provides for all of us in a kind of flattened out stability. If I could make a painting that accounted for both and rather than either or, how would that be constructed? It was probably the most emotional painting of the ones that make up the new work, just because the two people I was thinking about were two people who I knew and obviously loved tremendously, but I also wanted to critique and dissect and really think about how they operate relative to me, but also how their identities get flattened with these two simple words, two dads. Two dads thinking of doubling the kind of masculine archetype that foregrounds domesticity and home life in really specific, interesting ways.
You answered one of my questions, and thank you. That was profound. That's my favorite piece.
Thank you. Thank you.
What are the candles?
Those are images of La Virgen de la Caridad del Pobre, who is the patron saint of Cuba. And normally she is depicted with 3 men in a boat, Los Tres Juanes. And as the legend goes, they were lost at sea, and a statuette of the Virgin appeared in the water, and when they pulled her out of the water, she was dry, and they were able to make it back home. And so she became La Patrona de Cuba. In these, I've replaced the Tres Juanes with an image of balseros crossing the Florida Straits during the 90s, and the prayer on the back, which is often a prayer to the saint, or being represented on the front, is in these candles replaced with a prayer to Oshun, who is the syncretic embodiment of La Virgen de la Caridad del Cobra, the Orisha goddess of rivers and of sexual love. And so this is echoing the moments before my grandmother's death, when her nightstand and her dresser were covered with candles and other implements for the practice of hybridized religions, which I think are generally practiced, though not always admitted, by people from the island. My grandmother would have sworn Catholic, 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 but in practice, there was a lot of bones and stuff involved in her Catholicism. I'd also note that the rosary that I pointed out before, it has no cross on it. Instead of a cross, I placed a large mother bead, simply to go back to that notion of femininity and tenderness. I've never quite understood a chain of counting beads in which the prayers are all prayers to women. I've never understood why it ends with a prayer to a man. Like, why? Why that man? And certainly history tells us why that man, but it doesn't really make sense to me, since it seems that the devotional element of that has to do with to woman, to that which is capable of creating in the human form.